To say the revolution of 1905 was a revolution would be an overstatement. After the bloodbath of January 1905, riots and strikes started to erupt immediately. But it wasn't to be called a revolution, as it did not form an existential threat to the status quo, although perhaps it did to the few panicking elites. During the duration of this video, it will become clear why this wasn't a revolution in the purest sense. In order to calm the outrage of the people, the Tsar reluctantly published a manifesto called the October Manifesto, in which he announced the foundation of a constitution. His reluctance was so huge, he was even reported to avoid using the word constitution. If one were to really get deep into his reluctance to accept the new order, a riot involving some 2 million people was necessary to accomplish this step forward. In this new constitution, new freedom of speech laws were imposed, as well as a chosen parliament, called the Duma. This new government, seen by moderates as a step in the right direction, was a giant on feet clay. In order to understand this, we need to delve into the structure of this new political order. First and foremost, the Tsar preserved his status as autocrat and appointed both the Prime Minister and the State's Council, the Council of Ministers. He could also disband the Duma. The new order created by virtue of the so-called fundamental laws never uttered a word about how the Tsar needed the people's approval. The Tsar could also rule by emergency decree if the Duma didn't come together. All things considered, the constitutional reforms of 1906 mostly worked in favor of the nobility, as they were overrepresented in the voting process of the Duma, and the Duma couldn't pass any laws without the approval of both the Tsar and the State Council, in which, again, the nobility was overrepresented. After the votes for the first elections were counted, it was clear that the results were in favor of the more radical parties. Too radical for the elites and the Tsar. This was definitely not the result the elites and especially the Tsar had hoped for when they came up with the constitution. A party called the Constitutional Democrats, also known as the Cadets, had won the elections, getting 153 of the 448 seats in the Duma, and immediately demanded far-reaching reforms. They demanded the appointment of a government that was accountable to the Duma, the disbanding of the State Council, and universal suffrage for all males. The party that came in second after the elections was called the Group of Labor, known as the Trudovics. Their main support came from the farmers and laborers and were mostly concerned with the question of land and agrarian reforms such as land distribution. The united nobility started a campaign against the reforms of the Duma and somewhat justifiably said that the reparcellement of land wouldn't end poverty, and said that the poverty was mostly caused by the inefficient working of the town communities. The Tsar, however, didn't want to accept any of the radical demands and disbanded the Duma on the 8th of July. Meanwhile, Pyotr Stolypin was appointed as Prime Minister, a very controversial figure to say the least. Originally serving as governor of the Saratov province, he was a very aggressive man. According to leftist activists, this was a man with blood on his hands. The noose used for hanging dissidents was therefore famously called Stolypin's necktie. To describe this man, Figes says the following. According to the most fervent supporters of the Tsar after 1917, Stolypin was a stuck-up provincial civil servant who hollowed out the sacred principles of autocracy. But according to Stolypin's admirers, Putin being one of them, he was the only politician that could have prevented revolution and civil war in Russia. It was never Stolypin's intention to create a democratic Russia, but to use democratic means to support the Tsarist government. After the second elections, the results got in favor of an even more radical party, the Social Revolutionaries, who were Marxists. Of course, this would be a threat to the status quo, and therefore the Duma was again disbanded. To avoid an even more radical outcome after the next elections, it was first made sure that the electoral rights of farmers, laborers, and minorities were minimized in favor of a more conservative outcome of the third Duma election. Of course, the election got in favor of the elite. A government of lords and lackeys was formed, as the radicals would call it. The change of the voting laws was a breach of the fundamental laws according to liberals. By doing this, Stolypin had made the mistake of alienating himself from the liberals. Stolypin, however, justified the reforms by saying the Russian people, unlike people in the West, lacked the political education to take part in politics. Stolypin, however, realized that agrarian reforms were necessary, so much so that these reforms got the highest priority. There was, however, a huge problem. Many of the farmers felt tied to the land they had lived on for generations and didn't take the reparcellement, which was part of Stolypin's plan, positively. This was a traditional society, unaware of the capitalist means Stolypin used to make the agrarian reforms. Meanwhile, the elites, such as the nobility, army, and church, started to turn against Stolypin. This happened as soon as the threat coming from the farmers subsided, because the elite only adhered to Stolypin's plans as long as the threat from the farmers was present. Now Stolypin was seen as a threat. This had a few reasons. While the Tsar saw the Russian state as an extension of himself, Stolypin saw the state as the abstract booster for political reforms in service of the Tsar. Another aspect was the very strong personality that was Stolypin. This strong personality really started to show. In 1909, Stolypin proposed a law calling for the Navy to no longer be accountable to the royal court, but to the Ministry of Defense. The Tsar, of course, considered this to be a threat to his status as commander-in-chief. His agrarian reforms also resulted in a conflict with the nobility, and his educational reforms got into conflict with the church, which held on to their own church schools. During the 19th century, so-called Zemstvos were installed. These were independent, autonomous regions in Russia. Stolypin's plan was to give these Zemstvo farmers as much rights as the nobility that owned land. The nobility, however, wouldn't have it. He also wanted to abolish the agrarian courts and bring the farms under civil law. The idea was that these reforms were necessary in order to create a new class of conservative farmer citizens. Stolypin said, "First, we have to turn the farmers into citizens, small landowners. Only then the problem of the farmers can be solved." All things considered, Stolypin was someone who did have blood on his hands and a very controversial person, to say the least. However, reading about him also created a picture of a man who did have the best intentions, but had these during an era in which a rigid nobility didn't want to give up their privileges. On the 1st of September 1911, Stolypin was killed attending an opera in Kiev. When the Tsar heard about the news, he said, "Now we can finally leave behind us all that talk about reforms." Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna was also very relieved. Stolypin was a harsh opponent of a certain clerk the Tsarina was quite fond of, to say the least. A man born in a very rough area of Russia to a peasant family. Historians don't know much about his youth, but it is known he engaged in theft, disrespecting authorities, and drinking, something the peasantry was known for in general. Rasputin had been on pilgrimages earlier, but there was one that changed him profoundly. He swore off drinking, became vegetarian, and prayed a lot more than before. He embarked on several other pilgrimages afterwards, but the most influential, perhaps sensational, was the one where he joined the so-called Klisti, a religious sect that reportedly engaged in self-flagellation and sexual orgies. According to historians, however, there isn't much proof that he ever joined the group. During the early 1900s, word of Rasputin's charisma and activity began to spread through Siberia, and at some point he traveled to Kazan, where he presumably gained a status as a spiritual healer. Some church leaders arranged for him to travel to St. Petersburg. This was during a time in which spiritualism, theosophy, and the occult became popular among the aristocracy in St. Petersburg. His strange manners and antics made him a subject of curiosity. Eventually, he was introduced at the royal court and met with the Tsar in Tsarina on the 1st of November 1905. After returning to his hometown, he did not return to the royal court until July 1906, when he first met the children of the Tsar in Tsarina. At some point, Nicholas and Alexandra became convinced Rasputin had healing powers, which came in handy due to the fact that the heir to the throne, Tsarevich Alexei, suffered from hemophilia, an illness in which blood does not clot after bruising, resulting in a lot of pain and death if it healed rapidly. It was rightly called the curse. Many royal families throughout Europe suffered from this condition due to generations of inbreeding. His influence at the court possibly stemmed from the several times he managed to make the bleeding stop, and Tsarina had a passionate friendship with Rasputin because she believed he was the only one that could heal her son. Rasputin therefore became an indispensable part of the royal family. In one instance, when the Tsarevich was playing outside and fell, the bleeding was so severe, Alexei was close to death. Alexandra telegraphed Rasputin, telling him the situation and asked him to pray for Alexei. Rasputin responded, "God has seen your tears and heard your prayers. Do not grieve. The little one will not die. Do not allow the doctors to bother him too much." A day after receiving this letter, Alexei by a miracle recovered. Still, historians and physicians do not know how. Some, however, say his presence calmed down the Tsarina, which in turn allowed Alexei to calm down and therefore sped up his recovery. All things considered, Rasputin had a profound effect on the royal family, an effect so huge he cannot be ignored when talking about the last days of the Romanovs and their dynasty. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand wasn't the cause of the war, but it was the drop that broke the camel's back. Europe had been on the brink of war for several years, and in a huge sense, war had been inevitable for some decades. In the Balkans, the influence of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and of the Ottoman Empire started to decline due to the growing nationalism in that region. Due to conflicting interests between the Germans with their pro-Austrian policy and the Russian interests, who had considered themselves to be the protectors of the Slavic cause, as well as the future liberator of Constantinople, the cradle of Orthodox Christianity, which had been under Ottoman rule since 1453. Although historically, Russia had been pro-German because of the strong dynastic bonds between the Russian and German aristocracy, since the constitutional reforms of 1905, policy could no longer be seen as separate from public opinion. The Duma, along with the press, called for a more pro-Slavic stance and a more aggressive defense of Russian interests on the Balkans and against the influence of Vienna. Now this immediately created a dilemma of some sort. This pan-Slavic way of thinking also had a strong anti-German sentiment, and to add insult to injury, the Tsarina was of German descent, and the German influence at the royal court was strong. The Tsar, however, did eventually become convinced that Russia had to protect its interests on the Balkans. On the other hand, Minister of Foreign Affairs SD Sazonov warned against getting into the war. Russia simply wasn't strong enough. Germany was a newfound nation and the biggest military threat to Russia. It had gone through the process of unification, with Prussia at the front being the strongest kingdom of the German-speaking world. The French philosopher Voltaire once said that Prussia was an army with a state, instead of a state with an army. All things considered, Germany could easily beat Russia. Others, along with one called Durovno, warned that the unavoidable defeat of Russia could lead to a revolution inevitably. With a lot of foresight, he wrote, "The trouble will start with the government getting all the blame for all the calamity. The defeated armed forces, which will have lost most of their most trusted men, will be dragged by the primitive land hunger of the farmers and shall be too demoralized to serve as a stronghold of law and order. The legislative institutions and the intellectual opposition, which never really had any authority in the eyes of the public, will be powerless against the uproar they themselves created. Russia will fall into a state of hopeless anarchy." These moments must have been very stressful for Nicholas, as he stood in front of a huge dilemma. If he went to war, he would be at risk of manifesting what Durovno had warned for. If he did nothing, the nationalists might turn against the royal court because these were seen as too pro-German. He, however, had to make a choice, and he had to make it fast. A month after the assassination of Austrian Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Serbian nationalists, the Austrians declared war against the Serbs. Nicholas ordered the partial mobilization of his troops and urged the Austrian emperor not to go to war. However, Foreign Minister Sazonov urged the Tsar to fully mobilize, because he realized Germany would eventually declare war against Russia, which it did on the 1st of August 1914. He warned the Tsar that if he did not adhere to the people's call to take up the sword in order to defend Serbia, he would risk unleashing a revolution that possibly would result in him losing the throne. Reluctantly, Nicholas had to admit Sazonov was right and ordered the full mobilization on the 31st of July. Russia was now at war. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, subscribe, make sure to tap the notification bell and share this video. In the next episode, we will talk about World War I and its effects on Russia and the Romanov dynasty. Talk to y'all later.